When Jonathan Shaw brings his 7th pregnant mistress to me for the delivery, his friends start taking bets on how long it'll take before I break down. But even after the baby's cries echo through the delivery room, they never hear me lose control. Come on, this is the 7th one. Are you sure she isn't done with you this time? Jonathan shrugs. She can't have children, and I've got a family legacy to carry on. I'll end up having kids with other women, so they can inherit the family business either way. I might as well have a few now, and let her get used to it. As soon as he finishes speaking, I walk out carrying the newborn. Following standard procedure, I announce, congratulations. He weighs 7 pounds 6 ounces. Both the mother and the baby are doing well. Jonathan smiles as he takes the baby from my arms. Then he hands me a divorce agreement. Sign it, he orders. It's just an act to humor her. She refuses to have our 2nd child unless I divorce you first. Once the 2nd baby's born, we'll have 8 kids. I've gone along with his little charade 7 times already. This time, I sign my name without hesitation. Jonathan seems to have forgotten one thing. It's not that I can't have children. We're just genetically incompatible. If I want a child, I just have to find a different man. Why would I spend the rest of my life raising someone else's children just to stay married to him? Sophia's POV. I handed the signed divorce agreement back just as my husband's 7th mistress, Irene Lawson, was wheeled out of the delivery room. Without a second thought, my husband, Jonathan Shaw, shoved past me and rushed to her side. The impact hit my still healing abdomen, sending a sharp pain through me. My face turned pale. No one noticed. Instead, everyone crowded around Irene and asked if she was all right. I leaned against the wall and slowly made my way back to my office. The moment I spotted the miscarriage report on my desk, tears filled my eyes. 3 days before Jonathan's 7th illegitimate child was born, I had another threatened miscarriage. It was the 3rd child I'd lost. While I was writhing in pain on the operating table with no family member to sign my critical condition notice, Jonathan was at the opera house where we'd fallen in love. On the 3rd day of my recovery, he dragged me out of the hospital bed at 3 a.m. just so I could deliver his newest mistress baby. His bloodshot eyes followed me as I was pulled toward the delivery room. Sophia, Irene's still young. She doesn't know what she's doing. You're the only person I trust, he sobbed. That was the moment I silently changed into my scrubs. I stopped fighting back. Unlike the last few times, I didn't scream at him or demand answers. I even stopped swearing I'd rather take off my white coat and be condemned for abandoning my duty than walk into that delivery room. Instead, I personally wheeled my husband's mistress into surgery as if she were any other patient. After 10 years with Jonathan, I could tell that he had truly fallen in love this time. I reached out and gently touched the photo of Jonathan and me. His face was bruised and one of his arms was in a cast, while the other was wrapped around me. He was grinning from ear to ear. My trembling finger slid from its frame. Written in carefree strokes on the back were the words, "I'll protect Sophia forever." I had just turned 18 when my gambling-addicted father sold me to a brothel. Jonathan had saved me. He was beaten so badly that he broke his arm and could never play basketball again. Yet, while he was in the hospital, he pulled me in for a photo with a huge smile to celebrate my birthday. "Don't worry. I'll protect you from now on." I traced my fingers over his face in the photograph and muttered, "You saved my life once, and I gave you 3 children. We're even now." I tore the photo into pieces and threw them into the trash. A knock came at the door. Jonathan walked in. His eyes immediately landed on the empty picture frame. "Where's our photo?" he asked. Before I could answer, he excitedly held out his phone. "What do you think about this name for the baby?" The moment I saw the name on the screen, it felt like someone had crushed my heart. Years ago, he'd spent night after night flipping through books to find the perfect name for our first child. One of those names was now engraved on our baby's headstone. He had forgotten the name we'd chosen for our first child. I studied his face. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, and his eyes were filled with tenderness. It was unmistakably the joy of becoming a father again. That was when I finally accepted that he had truly forgotten that we had once had a child. Our baby had lived for only 37 days. He was born with a genetic disorder, so he was frail from the very beginning and never made it through his first winter. "Sophia?" Jonathan called my name when he noticed that I was lost in thought. The smile on his face faded. "I thought you'd made peace with this by now. I've told you that I need an heir. If you loved me, you'd understand that. Use this one." I cut him off, pointing at his phone. Jonathan followed my finger. He froze, but just as he was about to speak, a commotion erupted behind him. Sophia's POV. Jonathan's assistant, Timothy Rivers, stood awkwardly in the doorway. "Mr. Shaw, MS. Lawson is looking for you," he said. Jonathan immediately put his phone away and said, "I only changed my profile picture for now. It was just to make Irene happy. Don't think too much about it. I'll change it back later." With that, he hurried out. I watched quietly until he disappeared. Then I looked down and changed the matching profile picture I'd had with him for the past 10 years. I also unpinned our chat. He didn't know that I had already submitted the divorce agreement through my lawyer. In 1 month, our divorce would be final. There wasn't going to be a later. After handing over my work to a colleague, I returned to my hospital room. A bouquet of lysianthus sat on the bedside table. The caregiver smiled at me when she saw me come in. Your husband's so thoughtful. He sends you flowers every single day without fail. I looked at her unfamiliar face and smiled back. You must be new here. Everyone in this hospital knew that I had delivered all of my husband's mistress's babies. I had been the subject of gossip for years. Was that what she meant by love? The husband the caregiver was talking about wasn't Jonathan either, it was his assistant. Jonathan had always been meticulous about things. Even while he was busy with his mistress giving birth, he never forgot to have someone send me flowers for comfort. Before the caregiver could respond, I handed her the bouquet. Throw these away. I'm allergic to pollen. The smile vanished from her face. She took the flowers and left. A moment later, I got a message from Jonathan. Did you get today's flowers? I picked them out myself. My fingers paused over the screen. I was reminded of the day he proposed. The entire venue had been covered in flowers. Every single bloom had its stamens carefully removed. As he slipped the ring onto my finger, I saw cuts covering his hands and burst into tears. He just laughed it off. So? I told you I'd give you a proposal you'd never forget. I wasn't lying, was I? I knew what it looked like when Jonathan loved me. That was why I knew better than anyone what it looked like when he didn't. Yet I kept refusing to let go. I watched him father illegitimate child after illegitimate child with other women, and still, I couldn't bring myself to leave. I was tired now. If he wanted to have children with other women, he could have as many as he liked. I didn't reply. That night, I actually managed to sleep, but the nightmares never stopped. When I opened my eyes the next afternoon, Jonathan was beside my bed. He was holding my phone and frowning. Why did you change your passcode? I ignored his question. What are you doing here? A milky scent clung to his clothes. I instinctively turned my head away. Jonathan caught the look of disgust on my face. He furrowed his brows, but controlled his temper. You didn't reply to my message, he said with a trace of grievance in his voice. I looked at him in silence. We had promised each other that no matter when a message came in, we would reply as soon as we saw it. Somewhere along the way, our chat had become nothing but me talking to myself. If I remembered correctly, the last time he had replied was a month ago. He even used his alternate account for it. I was asleep, I said casually. I didn't see it. He hesitated, looking unsure of how to begin. Then he finally said, Irene wants a wedding. Sophia, could you give her the one you've been planning? I froze. After 7 years of marriage, we'd never had a wedding because his family refused to accept me. He promised that on our 7th anniversary, he'd finally give me one. I spent months planning every detail, but our anniversary had come and gone. The wedding had been repeatedly postponed. The first time he postponed it, he told me he had to leave on a business trip. In reality, he was taking his first mistress to a prenatal appointment. It had only been 3 months since we had lost our first child. On the very day the doctor told us that our genes were incompatible, and that we would never have a healthy child together, Jonathan started having an affair. Sophia's POV. The second time Jonathan and I tried to have a wedding, 3 of his mistresses showed up pregnant. I became a laughingstock in front of everyone we knew. By the 3rd attempt, I had unexpectedly become pregnant with our second child. The night before the wedding, he forced me to deliver his mistress's babies. By the time I walked out of the delivery room, blood was running down my legs. After that, he kept bringing one pregnant mistress after another to me. Arguments and screaming became part of our daily lives. Eventually, we both stopped talking about the wedding. I had waited 10 years for a wedding that never happened. Meanwhile, Irene got one without even trying. It made all those years I had spent clinging to him, hesitating, seem like one cruel joke. I blinked hard, forcing the tears back. Then I smiled. Sure. Jonathan was shocked. He hadn't expected me to agree so easily. He took my hand and said gently, Sophia, it's all my fault this time. I promise I'll give you the perfect wedding someday. I quietly slipped my hand free. I'm tired. I closed my eyes and said nothing more. Maybe it was guilt, but for once he didn't lose his temper. Instead, he tucked the blanket around me. Get some rest. I'll stay with you tonight. I didn't answer. Less than 5 minutes later, his ringtone shattered the silence. Jonathan got to his feet almost immediately. Irene, he muttered. I felt the breeze as he walked away. I opened my eyes and watched him disappear through the door. Then, I opened the text Irene had sent me. Since you two are divorced, pack your bags and leave. Stop freeloading in my house. Why are you still throwing yourself at someone else's husband? That's pathetic. One phone call is all it'll take for Jonathan to come running back to me. I glanced toward the doorway and gave a faint smile. I knew he wouldn't be coming back tonight. A little later, Irene posted a photo on social media. Jonathan was on one knee as he washed her feet. The caption read, "I can't bend over, so I had to make Mr. Shaw do it for me." She even tagged me. In the comments, Jonathan's friends affectionately referred to her as Jonathan's wife. I recognized every account that liked or commented on the post. It turned out Jonathan had already introduced Irene to all of his family and friends. I was the only one he'd kept out of that part of his life. The old me would have caused a scene. Now I simply liked the post and locked my phone. I didn't even care about Jonathan anymore. Why should it matter whose feet he was washing? The next morning, Irene stormed into my hospital room. She flung a divorce settlement agreement at me. "What gives you the right to take half of Jonathan's assets? He promised me that everything he owns would go to my son," she screamed, her face twisting with rage. "You're not taking a single cent from him." I calmly picked up the papers and flipped them open. "I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. I forgot to tell you that the apartment you're living in is in my name. You're the one who needs to move out." Irene's face flushed crimson. She jabbed a finger at me. "You bitch. You're nothing but a barren loser. You lost 3 babies, yet you still think you deserve his money? You're way too greedy. No wonder your kids paid the price." The moment those words left her mouth, I exploded with rage. I slapped her. At the same time, another slap landed hard across my face. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. Jonathan pulled Irene into his arms, his eyes burning red. "Who said you could touch her?" Sophia's POV. The moment Jonathan saw the blood at the corner of my mouth, he instinctively let go of Irene. Panic flashed across his face. "Sophia, are you okay?" "I didn't mean to." Just as he took a step toward me, Irene burst into tears. She clung to her arm and put on a wounded expression. "I was just here to thank Sophia for delivering my baby. I didn't think she'd throw your divorce agreement in my face and call me a homewrecker." Tears streamed down her face as she covered her cheek and pretended to be frightened. "I told her that we really love each other, and she slapped me. She even told me to get out of our apartment." As Jonathan's expression darkened, a flicker of triumph crossed Irene's face. She lifted her chin and shot me a smug grin. Without hesitating, Jonathan yanked me out of the hospital bed. "Apologize to Irene," he roared. I fell to the floor and looked up at him. Then I laughed. What part of what she said isn't true? Why should I apologize? Well, she got one thing wrong. She's not the other woman. She's the 7th one. "You." Irene burst into tears and collapsed into Jonathan's arms. I pulled myself to my feet, gave Jonathan one last cold look, and headed for the door. What if people start calling our baby a bastard because she won't apologize? Irene cried. "I'd rather die than let my child go through all that." In the blink of an eye, someone grabbed my wrist. Jonathan looked at me with so much contempt that he might as well have been looking at his sworn enemy. "Apologize." Then he issued a threat. "Don't forget that your grandmother is still in the intensive care unit. She's only alive because of the medical resources I provide." He pulled out his phone and called Timothy. "Stop producing Mrs. Yeager Sr.'s medication." My eyes widened in disbelief as I stared at the man in front of me. He knew my grandmother, Susan Larson, was the only family I had left in this world. Yet he was threatening to take her life for Irene's sake. Jonathan glanced at his watch impatiently. "Without that medication, her condition will worsen within 3 days." Even though my legs felt like they were made of lead, I turned around. Tears filled my eyes as I forced myself to apologize to Irene. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that." Irene timidly leaned against Jonathan. "She doesn't seem to mean it. Is she really apologizing? She hit me, yet she doesn't even have to face any consequences for that." My face still hurts. At some point, Jonathan had called for his bodyguards. One of them kicked me in the leg. My knee slammed into the floor. Cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Jonathan looked down at me. "Kneel and apologize to Irene. You're going to stay there until she believes you're sincere." I didn't move. He immediately made another call. A voice came from the other end. "Jonathan? Where's my granddaughter?" "Don't." I lunged forward, snatched the phone from him, and ended the call. "Don't tell my grandmother. She can't take this. I'll apologize." And so, I knelt outside the hospital room and repeatedly apologized to Irene. Passers-by stopped and watched the scene unfold with excitement. I lost track of how long I had been there. By then, my knees were badly swollen. Irene covered her mouth and yawned. "Jonathan, I'm tired." Jonathan immediately picked her up. As he passed by me, he coldly said, "Consider this a lesson. Don't come after her again." My strength gave out, and I collapsed onto the floor. After some time, someone suddenly dumped urine on me. "Is she that shameless quack doctor? She slapped a woman who just gave birth 3 days ago. So she's Mr. Shaw's wife? Hasn't her husband fathered 7 illegitimate children? I can't believe someone like her can be so cruel. She's even on the news." The sound coming from the television in the hospital room made me freeze. I forced myself to stand and rushed toward my grandmother's room. Chaos filled the room. Doctors were desperately trying to save her while footage of me kneeling on the floor played on the television. When my grandmother saw me, Her eyes widened. She clutched my hand tightly. Sweetheart, leave him. I can't keep being a burden to you. After saying those words, her eyes stayed wide open. Then she stopped breathing. I held her in my arms and stayed there until a shadow fell over me. I'm sorry for being late. My grandmother's dead. I'll make sure none of them get away with this, I said hoarsely. I looked up. My eyes were red, but I smiled. You'll help me, won't you? Third-person POV. Meanwhile, after tucking Irene in, Jonathan still couldn't shake the uneasiness weighing on him. He called Timothy. How is she? Mr. Shaw, something bad happened. Mrs. Shaw sold all the company shares under her name at a massive loss. The stock market has crashed. Just then, Jonathan happened to look up at the hospital's obituary board. The names of those scheduled for burial were scrolling across the screen. Among them was Susan's name. Third-person POV. Jonathan stood frozen in the middle of the crowded hospital hallway, his eyes locked onto the glowing digital board. Susan Larson. Time of death, 1432. The name burned into his retinas. The noise of the busy corridor, the squeak of rubber soles against polished linoleum, the distant chime of call buttons, the chatter of nurses, faded into a dull, rushing roar in his ears. Mr. Shaw. Timothy's voice quavered over the phone line. Did you hear me? The stock price is plummeting. Mrs. Shaw didn't just sell her shares, she dumped them. At 40% below market value to an undisclosed offshore institution. The board is calling an emergency meeting. We're losing millions by the minute. Jonathan didn't answer. His throat felt dry, constricted as if squeezed by an invisible hand. Mr. Shaw. Shut up, Jonathan whispered, his voice trembling. He hung up the phone and charged down the hallway toward the intensive care unit. When he burst into the room, it was already cleared. The bed was stripped of its sheets, the heart monitors turned off and pushed against the wall. The sharp scent of industrial disinfectant hung heavy in the air. Nurse Brenda, a senior nurse who had worked alongside Sophia for 5 years, was standing near the window, quietly packing a small plastic box with Susan's personal belongings. Where is she? Jonathan demanded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Where is Sophia? Brenda stopped, turning slowly to face him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her expression was colder than ice. She left Mr. Shaw, Brenda said, her voice dripping with quiet disdain. He took her grandmother to the funeral home. Why didn't anyone notify me? Jonathan roared, stepping forward, his hands clenching into fists. I am her husband. I handle her family's medical arrangements. You cut off her grandmother's life-sustaining medication 30 minutes ago. Brenda replied coldly, holding his gaze without flinching. You threatened her life to force Dr. Yeager to apologize to your mistress. And while you were tucking Ms. Lawson into bed, Susan Larson suffered a fatal cardiac arrest, brought on by sudden shock when she saw her granddaughter kneeling on the evening news. Jonathan stumbled back as if he had been struck. No, that was just a bluff. I told Timothy to hold the order. I didn't actually. Timothy executed your command immediately, Mr. Shaw, Brenda interrupted. Softly. Because you told him it was urgent. You killed the only family Dr. Yeager had left. And now, if you'll excuse me, I have to clean this room for a patient who actually deserves care. Jonathan stood paralyzed in the empty room, the weight of what he had done pressed down on his chest, threatening to crush his lungs. He whipped out his phone and dialed Sophia's number. The line you are trying to reach is currently unavailable. He called again and again. Blocked. Panicking, he rushed out of the hospital, ignoring Irene, who was calling his name from her room down the hall. He sprinted to his car and drove straight to the city's primary mortuary. Sophia's POV. The rain in Heston was cold and relentless. I stood under a black umbrella in the quiet courtyard of the memorial park, watching the simple wooden casket descend into the dark earth. Beside me stood Dr. Alexander Vance. Alexander was 34, a brilliant chief of surgery who had returned from abroad 6 months ago. More importantly, he was my senior classmate from medical school. The man who had repeatedly tried to pull me out of the abusive mire of my marriage years ago, only for me to stubbornly reject his help out of misplaced loyalty to Jonathan. Everything has been arranged, Sophia, Alexander said quietly, holding an umbrella over us both. The stock dump triggered the exact cascade we anticipated. Shaw Group lost 28% of its market capitalization in 4 hours. The board of directors is panicking. It's not enough, I said, my voice empty, staring down at the fresh dirt covering my grandmother's grave. He took 3 children from me. He took my dignity. And today he took the woman who raised me. I know, Alexander murmured softly. And that's why we won't stop until he has nothing left. Footsteps splashed heavily through the mud behind us. Sophia. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew the sound of his voice better than my own name. Jonathan stumbled into the clearing, his expensive suit soaked with rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked wild, desperate, his eyes frantic as they darted from me to the tombstone, and finally to Alexander standing closely beside me. Sophia, please, Jonathan choked out, stepping toward me. I didn't mean for this to happen. I swear to God, I didn't know Timothy would cut the medication right away. I was just angry because you hit Irene. Jonathan, I said, turning my head slowly to look at him. My eyes were dry. The tears had burned out hours ago. When he saw the look in my eyes, the complete, absolute lack of emotion, the utter absence of the devotion he had taken for granted for 10 years, he froze in his tracks. You don't have to explain, I said smoothly. You wanted an apology and I gave it to you. You wanted a divorce, and I signed the papers. My grandmother is dead, so you no longer have a bargaining chip to hold over my head. No. Sophia, the divorce agreement wasn't real. Jonathan reached out, trying to grab my hand, but Alexander stepped smoothly in front of me, placing a firm, unyielding hand against Jonathan's chest. Touch her again, Mr. Shaw, Alexander said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register, and I will personally file an injunction against you for physical assault and harassment, backed by the hospital's security footage from this morning. Jonathan glared at Alexander, his eyes bloodshot. Who the hell are you? This is between me and my wife. Former wife, Alexander corrected calmly. The divorce decree was officially filed with the family court 2 hours ago, accompanied by an expedited order, granted on the grounds of severe domestic abuse and public humiliation. You are no longer married, Mr. Shaw. Jonathan's face drained of all color. He looked past Alexander at me, his lip trembling. Sophia, you can't leave me, he pleaded, his arrogant composure completely shattered. We have 10 years together. I saved your life when we were 18, remember? I broke my arm for you. I looked at him, feeling a strange, hollow pity, not for him, but for the girl I used to be, who had let a single act of youth trap her in a decade of hell. You broke your arm for me when we were 18, Jonathan, I said, my voice carried away by the cold wind. And in return, I spent 10 years delivering 7 of your illegitimate children, watched 3 of our own babies die, endured your public humiliation, and lost the only family I had. I took a step closer to Alexander, resting my hand lightly on his arm. The debt of that broken arm, I whispered, has been paid in full. Third-person POV. The morning after the funeral, the business world of Heston was hit by a secondary earthquake. The divorce between Jonathan Shaw and Sophia Yeager was officially made public. Along with the court filing came a mountain of evidence released by an anonymous source, medical reports detailing Sophia's miscarriages, video footage of Jonathan forcing her to deliver his mistress's babies, and proof of his financial threats regarding her dying grandmother. The public outrage was immediate and catastrophic. Women's rights organizations launched boycotts against Shaw Group's commercial products. Major luxury brands pulled their sponsorships from Jonathan's real estate developments. The company's stock plummeted another 15% by noon. Inside the executive office at Shaw Group headquarters, glass shattered against the wall. Find out who released those medical files, Jonathan screamed at Timothy, his hands trembling as he stared at the financial news on his laptop. Trace the IP. Sue them for slander. Mr. Shaw, we can't, Timothy said nervously, sweating profusely. The medical files were released directly by the State Medical Board as part of an official inquiry into hospital ethics. Furthermore, Mrs. Shaw's legal team has served us with an eviction notice for your residence. Jonathan snapped his head up. What? The grand penthouse in the city center. It was registered under Mrs. Shaw's name prior to your marriage, funded by her late mother's estate, Timothy explained, cowering slightly. She has legally revoked your right of occupancy. Ms. Irene Lawson and the newborn are currently being escorted off the premises by local authorities. That bitch, Jonathan roared, grabbing his coat. Where is she? She's at the Royal Medical Center, Timothy whispered. She was just appointed as the Vice Department Head of Obstetrics and Gynecology, working directly alongside Dr. Alexander Vance. Jonathan felt a violent stab of jealousy and betrayal. Infertile? Depressed? He had convinced himself for years that Sophia was a broken, helpless woman who had no choice but to rely on him because no other man would want a woman who couldn't bear children. He had treated her like a saintly martyr who was obligated to accept his mistresses because she couldn't fulfill her duty as a wife. Now she was walking away with her dignity, her career, and the backing of one of the most powerful medical dynasties in the country. Without another word, Jonathan stormed out of his office and drove straight to the Royal Medical Center. Sophia's POV. The air at the Royal Medical Center was clean, bright, and professional. Unlike the hospital where Jonathan held financial leverage, this institution was backed by the Vance Medical Group, an international powerhouse that Jonathan's company couldn't touch even at its peak. I stood in my new office, adjusting the lapels of my crisp white lab coat. A knock came at the door, and Alexander stepped in, holding 2 cups of fresh coffee. How does it feel to be back in an operating room that doesn't smell like betrayal? He asked, handing me a cup with a warm, supportive smile. It feels like I can finally breathe, I admitted, taking a sip. Thank you, Alexander, for everything. You don't need to thank me, Sophia, he said softly, his gray eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my heart skip a subtle beat. I told you 6 years ago that you were the most brilliant surgeon in our class. You threw away your talent to play the dutiful wife for a man who didn't deserve to sweep the floors you walked on. I'm just glad you finally woke up. Before I could reply, a sudden commotion erupted in the corridor outside. Let me in, Sophia. I know you're in there. Jonathan's voice boomed through the hallway. I set my coffee cup down, my eyes turning cold. It seems my ex-husband hasn't learned his lesson. Alexander frowned, stepping toward the door, but I caught his sleeve. Let him in, Alexander. It's time to close the curtain on his little fantasy. A second later, Jonathan shoved past the hospital security guards, pushing the office door wide open. He looked disheveled, his eyes wild, his tie loosened. When he saw me standing beside Alexander, looking elegant, composed, and strikingly beautiful in my white coat, a wave of dark possession flashed across his face. Sophia, he sneered, though his voice cracked with underlying panic. So this is why you signed the divorce papers so fast. You were sleeping with Vance. Behind my back. I looked at him, feeling not anger, but a profound, chilling disgust. Jonathan, I said calmly, not everyone lives in the gutter like you do. Don't play innocent with me, he shouted, pointing a finger at Alexander. You gave up 7 years of marriage, threw away 7 of my children, just to run into his arms. You think he wants you? You're a barren woman, Sophia. You can't give him an heir. Once he gets tired of your body, he'll dump you just like any other woman. Alexander's expression hardened into steel. He stepped forward to strike Jonathan, but I raised my hand, stopping him. I looked at Jonathan, a faint, mocking smile touching my lips. Jonathan, I said quietly, walking toward him until there was only a foot of space between us. Who told you I was barren? Jonathan blinked, caught off guard. What? For 7 years, I said, my voice echoing clearly in the silent office. You brought mistress after mistress to me, boasting about your grand family legacy, using my alleged infertility as an excuse to cheat, abuse, and humiliate me. I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out a confidential medical folder, and tossed it onto the coffee table in front of him. Read it, I commanded. Jonathan frowned, his trembling hands picking up the document. It was an advanced genetic sequencing report from the National Medical Institute, dated 5 years ago. What is this? He muttered, scanning the complex charts. It's a reciprocal chromosomal translocation analysis, I explained smoothly, leaning against the edge of my desk. It proves that you and I carry matching recessive chromosomal defects. When our genes combine, it results in a 99% rate of severe embryonic lethal malformations or fatal infant genetic disorders, like the baby boy we lost after 37 days. Jonathan's eyes widened in confusion and shock. In simple terms, Jonathan, I continued, every word landing like a hammer blow to his ego. It was never that I couldn't have children. My eggs are perfectly healthy. My uterus is completely normal. We were simply genetically incompatible. Jonathan dropped the papers, his face turning ghost white. Incompatible? Yes, I smiled, my eyes flashing with absolute triumph. If I have a child with any other man on this planet, including Alexander, I will carry a perfectly healthy baby to full term. I stepped closer, whispering the final, devastating truth into his ear. I wasn't barren, Jonathan. I was just cursed to be married to you. Third-person POV. Jonathan stood frozen in the middle of the room, as if he had been struck by lightning. The words echoed in his mind, shattering the core foundation of his entire life's justification. For 7 years, he had built a narrative to excuse his infidelity, his cruelty, and his arrogance. He had convinced himself, his family, his friends, and the public that he was a victim of a barren wife, a noble patriarch forced to seek mistresses to carry on the proud Shaw family name. He had forced Sophia to deliver those children as a form of penance, taking pleasure in breaking her spirit piece by piece. And now the truth was laid bare. She wasn't broken. She wasn't infertile. He hadn't been saving his family legacy. He had simply been an unfaithful brute who destroyed his own true marriage over a biological impossibility that could have been resolved through simple medical science had he actually cared to listen to her 7 years ago. No. No, that's a lie, Jonathan stammered, backing away, his eyes filled with terror. You're making this up. You made up this report with him to embarrass me. The report bears the official seal of the National Genetics Board, Mr. Shaw. Alexander said coldly, walking over to the door and holding it open. Now take your pathetic denial and get out of Dr. Yeager's office before I have security throw you onto the street. Jonathan looked at Sophia. She stood there, serene and beautiful, completely unbothered by his breakdown. She didn't look at him with hatred. She looked at him as if he were a dirty stain on a clean floor. Sophia. Jonathan gasped, his voice breaking into a sob. Sophia, please. Come back. We can fix this. We can use donor technology. We can. Get out, Sophia said, her voice quiet, firm and absolute. Security guards materialized in the hallway, grabbing Jonathan by both arms and dragging him out of the building as he kicked, screamed, and begged for a forgiveness he would never receive. That evening, Jonathan returned to his temporary residence, a suburban townhome he had rented in a hurry after being evicted from the penthouse. The moment he opened the door, the screaming of newborn babies and the loud, shrill voice of Irene filled his ears. Jonathan! Irene shouted, barging out of the living room wearing a stained housecoat, her hair unwashed, her face pale and furious. Where have you been? The baby has been crying for 3 hours. The nanny you hired quit because you haven't paid her salary, and the bank just froze my credit card. Jonathan looked at her, the woman he had thought was sweet, gentle, and understanding. Without the soft lighting of the opera house, without the glamorous clothes he bought her, she looked exhausted, irritable, and demanding. Jonathan, are you listening to me? Irene yelled, grabbing his arm and shaking him. You promised me a grand wedding next week. You promised me half of your company shares. When are we moving into the new estate? Jonathan looked down at her hand on his arm, feeling a sudden, violent surge of disgust. Shut up, he muttered. What did you say? Irene screeched. I just had your son. I risked my life, giving birth to your 7th heir. I said shut up. Jonathan roared, shoving her away so hard she stumbled back onto the sofa. Irene froze, shocked. You want a wedding? Jonathan laughed hysterically, tears of rage streaming down his face. You want half my company? The company is bankrupt, Irene. The stock is worthless. I don't have a new estate. I have nothing. Irene's eyes widened in horror. What about the assets? What about the money you promised me? Sophia took her capital back. Jonathan screamed, tearing at his hair. Everything I owned was built on her family's initial trust. She sold her shares, revoked the property deeds, and exposed my tax structures. I am broke. Irene. Broke. Irene stood up slowly, the fake sweetness completely disappearing from her face, replaced by a cold, calculating malice. You're broke? She whispered. Then why the hell did I stay with an old man like you and give birth to this brat? Jonathan stared at her, stunned. What? What did you just say? You think I loved you? Irene sneered, laughing mockingly. You were just a golden goose. I endured your stupid demands, played the sweet little mistress, and let your barren ex-wife deliver my baby just so I could get your money. If you have no money, Jonathan Shaw, you're nothing but a pathetic old bastard. She turned around, grabbed her designer handbag, and walked toward the bedroom to pack her things. Wait! Jonathan yelled, running after her. What about the baby? What about our son? Keep him. Irene yelled back, pulling her suitcases out of the closet. He's your family legacy, isn't he? Pay for his formula yourself. Within an hour, Irene walked out the door, leaving Jonathan alone in the quiet, messy house, listening to the echoing screams of his 7th child. Sophia's POV. 2 weeks passed. Life without Jonathan was remarkably serene. With my grandmother laid to rest, and my legal ties to the Shaw family severed, I dedicated every ounce of my energy to my surgical work at the Royal Medical Center. Under Alexander's guidance, our team successfully performed a groundbreaking in utero cardiac repair on a 22-week fetus, securing our department a International Medical Award. On the night of the award gala, Heston's top medical and business elites gathered at the Grand Plaza Hotel. I wore a floor-length dark blue velvet gown, my hair styled in soft waves, diamond earrings catching the light. Alexander walked beside me in a sharp black tuxedo, looking handsome and commanding. As we mingled with hospital directors and international delegates, a low murmur rippled through the entrance of the ballroom. I turned my head and saw a figure stumbling into the venue. It was Jonathan. He looked pitiful. His suit was wrinkled and stained, his eyes hollow, his face pale and unshaven. He was holding a stack of legal papers in his shaking hands. Hospital security immediately moved to block him, but he dodged past them, his eyes frantically searching the crowd until they locked onto me. Sophia, he cried out, his voice raspy and broken. Sophia, please. Just 5 minutes. I beg you. The guests turned to watch, whispering among themselves. Alexander stepped forward, his expression darkening, but I touched his wrist. Softly. It's fine, Alexander. Let him speak. This is the final act. Jonathan staggered up to us, falling to his knees right in front of my high-heeled shoes, ignoring the stares of Heston's highest society. Sophia. He wept, lifting the papers toward me. Look. I brought the paternity reports. I brought everything. I looked down at him cold-heartedly. What is this, Jonathan? They're gone, Sophia. All of them. Jonathan sobbed, clutching at the hem of my gown like a beggar. Once the money ran out, every single one of them left. Irene, Clara, Vanessa. All 7 of my mistresses abandoned the children and fled the city. The crowd gasped in shock and hushed whispers. Jonathan looked up at me with tear-drenched eyes, his face filled with absolute, pathetic despair. I have 7 babies at home, Sophia. 7 infants screaming for milk, crying. For mothers who don't care about them, he cried, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. I was wrong. I was cursed. You were the only woman who ever truly loved me. You were the only one who stayed by my side when I had nothing. He reached out, trying to grab my shoes. Come back to me, Sophia. I'll get rid of the mistresses forever. We can put the children up for adoption. We can start over. Just come back to me. I'm dying. Without you. I looked down at the man who had once been my whole world. The man I had spent 10 years pleasing, hurting for, and weeping over. Now, seeing him kneeling in the dirt of his own creation, I felt no satisfying thrill of victory, only a profound sense of closure. Jonathan, I said softly, my voice calm and crystal clear. He looked up, a tiny spark of desperate hope flickering in his hollow eyes. Sophia? You didn't love me when you saved me at 18, I said evenly. You just loved the feeling of being a hero. And you didn't love those mistresses, you just loved your own ego, wrapped up in the idea of a family legacy. I took a step back, pulling the silk of my dress out of his reaching fingers. You wanted 7 children to carry your name, Jonathan, I said, looking down at him with quiet, unyielding grace. Now you have them. They are your legacy. Enjoy raising them alone. I turned my back on him. Security, Alexander called out smoothly, taking my hand in his. Please remove this trespasser. The security guards grabbed Jonathan by his arms, dragging him backward across the polished marble floor. Sophia. Jonathan screamed, his voice cracking into raw, agony-filled shrieks that echoed through the grand ballroom. Sophia. Please. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't turn back. I squeezed Alexander's hand, smiled at the medical director standing in front of us, and stepped forward into the bright, beautiful light of my new life. Third-person POV. 3 months later. The fall of Jonathan Shaw was complete and irreversible. Without Sophia's initial capital trust, and with his corporate reputation destroyed by financial fraud investigations, Shaw Group filed for Chapter 7, bankruptcy. All of Jonathan's remaining assets, his cars, his stocks, his luxury properties, were seized by the bankruptcy court to liquidate his debts. Even worse, the court mandated that he remain personally responsible for the child support and care of the 7 infant children left behind by the mistresses who had fled the jurisdiction. With no income, no home, and no executive status, Jonathan was forced to move into a tiny, dilapidated 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Heston. Every day was a living nightmare. The small apartment echoed 24 hours a day with the sound of crying infants, formula cans, dirty diapers, and stained baby clothes piled up in every corner. Jonathan, who had spent 10 years barking orders at servants, assistants, and a devoted wife, was now forced to wash bottles, change diapers, and warm milk until his hands were raw and blistered. He tried to hire nannies, but no one would work for a bankrupt man whose name was reviled across the state. He tried to put the children up for state adoption, but because he had legally declared himself their biological father on their birth certificates to spite Sophia years ago, the legal process was bogged down in endless bureaucratic red tape. Every night, as he sat on a broken stool in the middle of a room filled with screaming babies, he would look at the dark screen of his phone. He had tried to call Sophia thousands of times. Every number he used was immediately blocked. One rainy evening, while carrying 2 crying infants in his arms, Jonathan turned on the small, dusty television sitting on a cardboard box. The local news was broadcasting a live segment from the National Medical Excellence Gala in the capital city. The screen showed a grand stage bathed in warm, golden light. The announcer's voice echoed through the tinny speaker. And tonight's highest honor, the National Gold Medal for Pediatric Surgical Innovation, is awarded to Dr. Sophia Yeager and Dr. Alexander Vance. The camera zoomed in on the stage. Sophia was wearing an exquisite emerald green gown, her hair falling gracefully over her shoulders. She looked breathtakingly radiant, her skin glowing, her smile confident and brilliant. Beside her, Alexander Vance stood tall and handsome, holding the heavy gold trophy. As the applause thundered through the auditorium, Alexander turned to Sophia, looking at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated love and admiration. Then Alexander reached out, gently hand in hand with her, and placed a soft, loving kiss on her forehead. The camera panned down slightly. Sophia rested her hand gently against her abdomen, where a subtle, beautiful baby bump was clearly visible beneath the elegant silk of her gown. The news anchor's voice chimed in warmly. In addition to their medical triumph, we have just learned that Dr. Yeager and Dr. Vance are expecting their first child together early next spring. A truly healthy, miraculous fresh start for our country's finest surgeon. Back in the dark, filthy apartment, Jonathan stared at the screen. A healthy baby. Her eggs were fine. Her body was fine. She was carrying another man's child, a healthy, thriving child, with ease, beauty and joy. Jonathan dropped the formula bottles in his hands. They shattered against the dirty floor, white milk splashing over his worn shoes, mixing with the trash and the endless, agonizing screams of the 7 children he was condemned to raise alone. He fell to his knees in the middle of the mess, clutching his head, screaming into the empty darkness of his ruined life, realizing that he had possessed heaven and had cast himself into hell. Sophia had moved on into the bright, warm sunshine of love and fulfillment, leaving him behind in the eternal shadow of his own foolish choices. 1 year later, the sun shone brightly over the gardens of the Vance private estate in Belton. Sophia sat on a comfortable white wicker lounge chair under the shade of an old oak tree, holding a gentle breeze against her skin. In her arms lay a 4-month-old baby girl, healthy, chubby-cheeked, with bright, curious dark eyes and a soft tuft of black hair. "She's finally asleep?" a gentle voice asked. Sophia looked up and smiled as Alexander walked across the green lawn carrying a tray with fresh fruit and a glass of chilled juice. "Just went down," Sophia whispered, cradling the baby close to her chest. "Dr. Vance, your daughter inherits your stubborn refusal to nap." Alexander laughed softly, sitting on the edge of the chair beside her. He leaned down, brushing a stray lock of hair from Sophia's forehead, before kissing her lips softly. "She inherits her mother's brilliance and beauty," Alexander murmured, looking down at the sleeping child with infinite tenderness. "That's all that matters." Sophia rested her head against Alexander's shoulder, looking out over the beautiful garden. Her phone, sitting on the small table beside her, vibrated quietly with a news push notification. Final court verdict. Former CEO Jonathan Shaw sentenced to 5 years for corporate fraud. Remaining assets transferred to State Child Welfare Trust. Sophia glanced at the headline for a brief second, her expression utterly unchanged. She didn't click the link. She didn't read the details. She simply turned the phone face down, leaned into her husband's warm embrace, and closed her eyes, listening to the peaceful heartbeat of her healthy child, sleeping safely in her arms. The past was dead, and her life had finally begun.